Okay, so for this question, I want you to imagine that Facebook is launching a new dating app. Mm-hmm. And I know that Facebook has already announced this to the public, but I want us to consider a few key decisions that the team is trying to go through. Mm-hmm. Specifically, the team is trying to decide whether or not to launch on a variety of platforms, mm-hmm. and whether or not for it to be a standalone experience or bundled with a Facebook app. Mm-hmm. So to clarify for you, I'll just write on the whiteboard the four kind of decisions that we have. Yeah. So the first decision that we want is iOS, Android, mobile web, and desktop web. Yeah. And the second decision is bundled, standalone. So we want a decision for the team, and you're in charge of the team. And unfortunately, we don't have enough engineering bandwidth to be able to actually build on all these platforms and do all the decisions. So we'll have to pick one of these to build on and one of these as a decision. To clarify, iOS and Android are the native apps that appear on your phone, the apps you click. Mobile web is the website you would go to. You go to a website. Right. And then desktop web is obviously the website on your computer. Bundled means that it would be in the Facebook app or Facebook.com website. Right. So you would access that dating app there. Right. And standalone means that it would be a separate experience, a separate name, and a separate website. So www.facebookdating.com or something that you would name, or that you could we can come up with as a team. Does that all make sense?
That does make sense.
Okay, great. So I'd love for you to tell me your strategy and thoughts on how you would go about making this decision as a team, and then I'd like us to come to a final answer on this, and you can feel free to ask me follow-up questions as well.
Great. I'm just going to write my thoughts on the whiteboard.
Absolutely, go ahead.
So I guess my first clarifying question is, are we talking about a beta launch, or are we talking about a full-fledged launch after having beta tested?
Great question. So for the team, we're really focused on initially testing the hypothesis that this is a good idea and a good product that will get adoption. So we are launching an early public release to the public. So we're not launching a beta because we believe that a beta won't be very useful if we don't have enough people in the pool, because it's a dating app and we want to make sure we get a wide net when we first launch. Yeah. So we are launching publicly, but the important thing is that we are launching as a prototype, and this is the important first step for us to validate this market.
Got it. And so so given that it is a beta test,
sure.
The first thought that comes to mind is picking what geography or what market we should test this app idea in. So for example, I know that Facebook tests new features in geographies like New Zealand because it has critical mass of people and a representative sample for them to get good signal on whether you should move forward with the product idea or not. And so to pick the right market, I want to understand better how our team is thinking about which set of early adopters we're targeting as far as users are concerned.
Okay.
So let's kind of think about users now. So given that this is a dating app, one way to think about users is just in terms of age ranges.
Okay.
So we can maybe roughly break this down as essentially 18 to 25, which essentially represents the millennial population. We can look at essentially 25 to 35, and then 35 plus. It would seem that the most intuitive user group to pick would be those users who are between the age of 18 to 25.
Why is that?
So in theory, we would have to essentially do some market research. I'm happy to dive into what kind of questions we want to ask to validate this. So
we don't have to go too into the details of the market research, but why is that? Why should that be our initial hypothesis that that's the right market for this dating platform?
Got it. So if we want to state the mission of this dating app, the mission of the dating app is to essentially be able to facilitate romantic connections through Facebook for people who are single. And if we look at comparable apps like Tinder or Hinge that are also trying to essentially facilitate romantic connections for people who are single, market research has shown that a majority of their user base does fall into this age range. And so it would make sense then that we should target the same age range to get essentially a better sense of whether our dating app will work.
Gotcha. Just to push you on this, I mean, if other competitors are in the space, why shouldn't we target a different population of users? Like, how are you confident that this is still the right segment, given that it's kind of seemingly a crowded space?
Right. So I think one thing to note is that the dating app market is not a zero-sum game. In fact, it's a market where users are likely to download many different dating apps. And so just because a user has Tinder or just because a user has Hinge doesn't mean that they won't have Facebook's dating app, and vice versa. So in some sense, there is no crowding out in this market. The second point to note is that we care about making as many, we have to define a set of metrics that we care about. I would hypothesize that we want to maximize the number of connections that this dating app facilitates. And according to some of the market research data that we found, it looks like the other age ranges result in much fewer connections being formed, just because there are far fewer people who are single in these age groups relative to the 18 to 25 age group.
Totally. Okay, I'm sold. Let's go ahead with that user segment.
Got it.
Continue.
So now that we've identified that we want to target users who are between the age of 18 to 25, to answer the platform question, we would want to figure out we want to essentially look at our entire user base across geographies and figure out what is the distribution of platform usage across users within this age range. So what I mean concretely is how many users in the US use iOS and were between the age range of 18 to 25. And similarly, you can ask these questions for Android mobile web and desktop web, and do that for major geographies.
Gotcha. So what we're doing is we're looking at the users in that age group and seeing which of those platforms best satisfy that requirement. We want that age group.
Exactly. Because our next step after identifying the user group is to pick a test market. Given previous Facebook launches where we want to pick a market that has just about the right critical mass, we want to essentially set a certain cap on the number of users that we want to release this product to. I'm gonna go ahead and pick New Zealand because that has historically been the market that Facebook has targeted for previous product launches.
Okay.
It seems to have a representative sample of users.
So you wrote US on the board. Is that something that you're changing then, or?
That was just an example.
Okay, I see.
Using this methodology so I would use this methodology just to do a sanity check, just to make sure that, for example, we don't have any other geography that has maybe an interesting distribution of like platform usage. I would likely scrap this method altogether and just pick New Zealand because that seems to be historically has been a successful representation of product for our beta tests, essentially.
Gotcha. So what you were saying is, let's pick a country that has a small customer segment, that's connected to one another, so that we can pilot this program.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we picked the New Zealand market.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, now that we picked New Zealand, given that in the early stages we would want to maximize, so the value proposition of this dating app is essentially in people making connections, of being connected to each other. That is one metric that we can use as a measurement of whether this app is adding value to users. And for us to have a better shot of maximizing connections, we want to pick a platform that users in this age demographic use within New Zealand. And so I would work with a data analyst and essentially ask him to let me know what the distribution is between iOS, Android, mobile web, and desktop web is.
Gotcha. So you're looking for, given this age group, which of those has the highest proportion of users?
Exactly.
Gotcha.
let's say that we see that there are more Android users in New Zealand than there are iOS users in New Zealand, but we don't have specific data on their patterns of usage on their mobile phones versus their desktop versus their browser. So we do know that the Android devices are more popular there, but we're not as sure exactly about the overall usage of Android mobile web versus desktop web. So do you have any maybe hypotheses that we might be able to go off of here that might be able to eliminate some of those platforms or justify some of the platforms?
Got it. So just to play back what you're saying, it sounds like you're saying that that we don't essentially have a clear sense of time spent on each of these platforms, even if usage in Android is higher. So essentially, it's very possible that time spent on iOS could be higher than on Android.
So what I'm saying actually, and maybe to clarify, is that basically we know that there are more Android devices in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So more users are using Android devices.
Yeah.
But given that they're using an Android device, we don't know how much they're using the Android app
Mm-hmm.
on their phone
Mhm.
versus the Android, maybe their Chrome or Safari browser, or they don't have Safari, but their Chrome browser on their phone, versus using their desktop computers, because a lot of those users also have desktop computers. So all we can really know is that in this international market, we are seeing more Android devices owned by users than iOS devices being owned by users. Does that help clarify that?
Got it. I think I understand.
So there are, if I maybe to give a concrete example, let's say there are 100 New Zealanders. Out of them, 70 of them own Android phones, and 30 of them own Apple phones.
Apple phones.
So that's the data that maybe is helpful in making that decision for you. But we still we don't know if those 70 users are using their apps more than they are using Chrome and just Googling things in their browser,
Right.
versus going home and just using their desktop browser a lot for certain experiences. So it's a little hard for us to map exactly, given the type of experience it is.
Yeah.
Obviously, certain things are higher on the native, certain things are higher on the mobile web, and certain things are higher on your desktop, given that 70 of those users are Android users.
Got it. So we have to figure out. Essentially what platform is best tailored to this experience that the dating app provides.
Mm-hmm.
That would depend on a number of factors. One being the actual design of the product. So, for example, if our product is designed to have a fairly similar user interface to Tinder and Hinge,
Mm-hmm.
that would kind of imply that we're better off targeting mobile versus desktop web or even mobile web.
Well, I guess my question to you is, what sorts of design principles or what behaviors do we want to see in this app by these users that might justify one of these platforms?
Got it. So essentially, we want to see frequent. So we want to see frequent usage, and we want to see low abandonment rate. So essentially, when users open the app, we want them to be spending a reasonable amount of time swiping left to swiping right on connections, and we would want them to spend a majority of the time doing that versus, for example, using other parts of Facebook, which I think might bleed into this second question, but I think we want to essentially see frequent usage, and we would also want to see. So we'd also have to figure out what our policy is and how many connections we surface to users, whether we want to cap the number of people that users see and refresh and show them new connections on subsequent days and so on. As far as picking the platform is concerned, we'd have to. Can I assume, for example, that I can get more cuts on user data in New Zealand in terms of?
So I mean, let's say that I know we typically as Facebook operate a lot in New Zealand, but for the purpose of this exercise and this question, really the main piece of information that we have is just the iOS Android breakdown in the country. There's not many Windows Phone users, so it's mostly just iOS Android, and we just want to understand maybe why we would pick one of those platforms over another platform here. I know that you mentioned that frequent usage is an important criteria. Are there other important criteria that might be useful, or maybe factors that might be relevant in deciding between those platforms that you're considering over there?
I would say that if you want to think about the medium term, in terms of potentially monetizing this app in the future, we want to look at what the willingness to pay is for customers in iOS versus Android, mobile web, and desktop web.
Okay.
For example, like there's this common hypothesis that essentially users of iOS generally have higher disposable income and so are willing to pay for in-app purchases. And if we are trying to make money off this dating app in the medium term, then we might want to target iOS, just because we can then experiment with more product features that actually generate revenue. One advantage of trying Android is that Android has about 85% global market share. And so by essentially working out the kinks with the Android experience, we can then roll this out very easily to most of the developing world. With essentially the learnings that we've got in the New Zealand market. And this holds true actually for mobile web as well, because this holds true actually for mobile web as well, because there are essentially a large number of users who might access Facebook through essentially mobile browsers, and so figuring out essentially like pain points and figuring out kinks would allow us to easily scale our launch post beta. With desktop web, I mean, I think with desktop web, it seems a little disjoint from the second part of whether we want to make this a bundled or a standalone experience, because it sounds like with desktop web, you would have to essentially integrate this dating app into core Facebook versus creating a standalone Facebook dating app website. It doesn't seem to sit well with the general perception of Facebook's offerings.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and come to a decision about maybe at least point one, and then I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thought process for point two.
Sure. I'm going to pick Android because given that you mentioned that Android is a device, so Android essentially is the dominant device that users own. I think I'm picking it because one, I think we can maximize connections and essentially also be able to generalize our learnings across like far more markets as we plan to like scale this launch out.
Great. Okay, so given that we've picked Android, now my question to you is the second question, which is, do we want to bundle this in the Facebook app so that if I go to the Facebook app, I can access this dating platform? Or do we want a separate app with a separate logo, separate branding from the Facebook app?
Got it. Yeah, I think we should probably look at the trade-offs between both options. But before we do look at the trade-offs, I think some of the metrics we want to consider are what metrics do we care about? One metric we care about that I mentioned before was maximizing connections. Another metric we could care about is maximizing engagement or time spent on the app. And a third metric, which might be more medium term, is monetizing the dating app through in-app purchases or essentially premium offerings and whatnot. So if I try to fit both the bundled and standalone experience to these three metrics, what I would say is with the bundled experience, essentially the advantage we get is that users can very quickly search for matches that have been proposed to them, allowing them to make higher quality decisions on whether they want to connect with someone, because they essentially have access to Facebook Core, and so essentially you can use Facebook Core to inform some of the decisions you make about whether you want to swipe right on someone, for example.
Gotcha. So you're talking about the data sharing, basically to make the platform better, will be more useful.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Go ahead.
Why couldn't we just port that data over under the hood without it necessarily being ostensible to the user that these things are combined? So perhaps I could have an offline data store that pulls all the data from Facebook and then imports the relevant data to the dating app, and we can still Facebook authenticate into a different dating app. So is there a reason why does it have to be in the same platform for this particular point that you're making?
I think I think the thing that comes to mind immediately when you bring this up is user privacy, and essentially you would have to essentially make this very clear in your terms of service that you are doing this, and that could disincentivize many users from wanting to sign up.
Okay.
If they feel that data that they don't want to share is being shared in this standalone dating app. With the bundled experience, essentially, you don't have to be as upfront with users because essentially you have, because it's integrated into Facebook Core, then Facebook search is fair game, and so people can then do their due diligence on Facebook Core without having to, and Facebook doesn't have to worry about any liability on the data privacy side.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that.
And but that being said, the advantage of standalone in this context is that a user is essentially intentionally choosing to, when a user logs into the standalone dating experience, they're intentionally choosing to experience Facebook this way, and so they're more likely to not only have their attention focused entirely on the process of making connections, but also will likely spend more time because there are fewer distractions available to them. So what I mean by this is that with the bundled experience, it's very possible that users might not spend as much time on Facebook because then they might start scrolling through newsfeed or going to some another part of the platform, and that would detract from the experience, the dating app, versus a standalone experience where users have intentionally self-selected into wanting to use the app, and as a result will spend more time on it.
Gotcha. Okay.
And in that sense, it seems to me that creating a standalone experience is compelling both from the engagement side and likely from the connection maximization side. However, we would have to think a little more carefully if we build a standalone app about what information we're surfacing about people on the app.
Gotcha. And so does standalone to you beat bundled or tie bundled with regards to connections? Or is bundled better for connections and standalone still does a good job getting connections? How are you thinking about that point and the trade-off between those two? It's not really clear to me based on the diagram.
Yeah. I think standalone is tied with bundled.
Okay.
So the advantage that bundled had is that people can make higher quality decisions about connections, and so they essentially have more trust, but perhaps in the app and essentially in using it. But that could also result in fewer connections being made. While with the standalone app, essentially users are you can tailor the experience towards maximizing connections, and as a result, if we believe that there'll be higher engagement on the app, then that's going to be correlated to connections being maximized as well.
Okay. Great. Let's move on to a decision or monetization and however.
I guess with monetization, by creating a standalone app, we introduce a new surface in Facebook's ecosystem, and we can essentially think of it as a standalone surface to monetize, without worrying about cannibalization. So, with a standalone app, we can essentially leverage the data that Facebook has in terms of servicing matches, but we can employ a lot of the techniques that other dating apps have used to monetize, including freemium offerings, in-app purchases, profile boosts, and whatnot. And that opens a lot more monetization opportunities versus a bundled experience where you don't have as much real estate in terms of designing this app to create as many monetization opportunities. Furthermore, like I'm still of the belief that a bundle experience results in could actually hurt monetization if users spend more time on this app versus, say, scrolling through newsfeed.
Gotcha.
And so my decision would be to essentially pick a standalone app.
Okay, great. Just to do a quick time check. So, in the interest of time, I want to make sure we get to the feedback.
Yeah.
So you can go ahead and sit down and we can answer the question. Overall, again, great job. These are of course challenging questions. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into feedback. But before I do, is there anything that you wanted to reflect on about how your answer went and anything that you might have changed, just to give yourself kind of attuned to that sense of feedback, self-feedback?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So I think I started off well with a decent amount of structure. I kind of figured out that we want to first start with users, figure out that age might be a relevant way to break down our user demographic. And then I made a reasonable case for why we might want to pick the 18 to 25 age range. I then went in a slide circle where I kind of first mentioned a methodology for picking a market, but then went back on that and mentioned that we would just start with New Zealand because that's historically been where we beta tested many new product launches. I think I got stuck on essentially figuring out right metrics for picking Android over other platforms. I think at the end of the day, I tried to think about things, but then just went with the simple solution of Android being the dominant one and using that as an excuse to argue that we're likely to maximize connections that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where I struggled the most. I think also in my articulation of bundle versus standalone, it may not have been as convincing for why I picked standalone, but I still felt that I did a decent job of at least listing down these three metrics to consider. So it was an okay, very average answer, but not terrible.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about it. So I think that overall, your strategy in the beginning was great, where you defined goals, right? You were like, okay, what goals do I want? And the goal of the dating app, what is the mission? I think is the exact word that you used. And when we think about metrics and analytical questions, I think it's really important to always start with the goals, and then we kind of go from there, and we can kind of figure out things.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, it would have been great before anything to really just hone in and write our goals of this app on the page. And you asked me questions, and one of our goals is to pilot this program to see if it even works.
Right.
Another goal, of course, of the app is to attract a large user base and to get them to date each other and to get them to start connecting with each other. So, once we have kind of set up those goals, and then we can kind of actually start talking about, okay, now that we have these goals, what can we do or what decisions can we make that support these goals? So I think it would have helped frame our discussion. I actually think you did a great job in the second half of trying to do this, but if we had done that in the beginning, it would have been really helpful to kind of know already off the bat, what are we interested in, what are we looking for?
Right.
So a few more points here where I thought that, in the beginning, I thought we could have done a little bit better job justifying this user segment, and I pushed you on it. Really, all I was kind of looking for here was just this idea that over time, like as you get higher in age, there are a lot fewer people that want to date. So our user base will decline.
Yeah.
And if one of our goals had been largeness of user base, that would have been really easy to identify off the bat. But since that wasn't actually one of our goals, it may have been a little harder for us to determine that. I like that you did a lot of stuff with playback. You kind of playback things to me, and that's a really effective tool in interviewing, so great job with that. But I did think you could ask more questions of me to understand the scope of things. Like, clearly I had some information that I was willing to give you,
Right.
so it might have been worthwhile spending a little bit more time with that. I thought your usage of the whiteboard was better this time, and it was great that you did it, but I did think it got confusing at some points.
Yep.
So one really quick thing is, like, if you were ever to eliminate an option while you were talking about it, you could simply do like this. And then also these arrows, while they show connection, they don't really explain to you what exactly is going on there.
Yeah.
And it might have been more useful to kind of do something like this, where you have bundled and then standalone. And then you had your criteria here, 1, 2, 3. And then we can kind of talk about it really clearly, right? So we can talk about it like, this, this, or which one is better, or if they're tied, we can do this. And that simple kind of cost-benefit matrix right there would be really helpful, I think, a little bit to talk about these sorts of issues. I think the area where we really struggled a little bit was kind of justifying this decision.
Right.
And we spent a lot of time talking about it. And there are some aspects that I think weren't mentioned that should have been mentioned.
Right.
So one of which is messaging is really critical to any dating app, right? And just thinking about that, like one of the goals of our dating app is probably to have people use that dating app to communicate with one another. And if we have a messaging platform, that kind of immediately eliminates desktop web off the bat, because we're not expecting that users are going to be on their desktop web like messaging each other that frequently. Another justification for why not desktop web is that desktop web is generally an older population segment that uses it more, rather than this younger population segment that are more attuned to kind of the app-based world than the desktop web world. The other factors that I thought we could have mentioned were the fact that mobile web gets you iOS and Android in one go, which is kind of a neat deal. So, both users on both platforms can actually log into mobile web browsers. We also didn't really talk about until the very end, but the internationalization of Android versus iOS. And then, in general, I would say that the cost of building these tools wasn't discussed. So, for example, like iOS making an app, Android making an app, all of these have different kind of costs associated with them. Making an app versus making a website, even bundled versus standalone, have different costs associated to maintain and upkeep them.
Right.
And it might have been nice to have a discussion about the costs associated on an engineering perspective that are factors here. So maybe a fourth criteria for us would actually have been ease of building, or like the financial cost of launching something like this.
Right.
And it's at least nice to allude to those things, even if they don't become major points in your interview. I also, generally think that otherwise we did a good job of kind of eventually discussing all of these criteria. But again, it would have been nice to have something like this matrix or some way to understand which ones were better where. So even if you had said something like, okay, we're going to eliminate desktop because old users are on desktop, young users are here, which is what we already defined earlier, and we're also looking for users that are messaging. And I think, if we had done that for each of these and maybe hashed out a little bit more about, other than user base, what are we looking for? We're looking for users. We're looking for maybe a small knit community. We're looking for users who are willing to message, and those kinds of criteria would have been helpful. Great. So moving on from that, otherwise I did think we did a much better job in question 2. I think that the user privacy point was awesome and great and very aware of what's going on with Facebook. And I would actually say that if you're ever interviewing for a company like Facebook or any company, you can even nod to that. So if I were a Facebook interviewer and you had said something like, well, it would be great if we were really careful about this because I know it's an important issue for Facebook and we're designing for Facebook, that would be a fantastic point to bring up during the interview. Otherwise, I thought you did a much better job outlining goals. And again, the kind of arrows were a little confusing to me. And I thought we could include a few more criteria here. My last point on this that was a little unclear to me was that these 2 points seemed a little connected to me, and it didn't seem like they were that distant to me. I think I got a little confused by what connections meant then, or like what engagement versus connections really were. And maybe one way I would think about it that might have been a better point to make on this board might have been something like, users. Because obviously you're going to get more users with a bundled approach because automatically they're in the Facebook app. And there's no friction, there's no switching costs of going to a standalone new app.
Right.
So that might have been a better point to make in this point that kind of hints at what you're trying to say. And then while you may have gotten more users, you might have gotten less engagement on one of the platforms. You want to weigh those. You want to think about those differently. But I do think two really important points to make up here are one, the brand. The fact that do you want to develop this as a new brand, and what does that mean for the brand of Facebook? Because do we want Facebook associated with this sort of dating app? How does that rub with Facebook?
Right.
Do people feel the privacy issue is too much for them? And then secondly, the switching cost is going to be too high. So we want to make sure the switching cost is low enough such that we can actually get enough users, or users actually really care about this enough. And that's your hypothesis going into this, is that once Facebook launches a dating app, everyone will flock to it who wants to flock to it.
Right.
So those are my key feedback. I would say overall, you totally improved through the session, so that's great. I would say to work on a little bit of the thought process, and I think part of it really was just a bit of more thought about what are the differences with each of these platforms, and what do they get you and what do they don't get you, and what are the differences here from a brand perspective, from a switching cost perspective, and from a variety of different perspectives. All right. I think that's it. So thank you, Aditya, for being on the interview, and thank you for watching.